Who do you think was the first superhero in the Marvel Universe? Was it Iron Man, Captain America, Spider-Man? Well, if you said any of those, you would be wrong. According to the Marvel Encyclopedia, the first superhero in the Marvel Universe was the Human Torch in 1939, and not the Human Torch from the Fantastic Four team, a totally different Human Torch, but I won't get into that because it's really complicated. Anyway, back at that time, Marvel Comics was operating under a different name. They called themselves Timely Publications, and they had a line of comics focused on superheroes called Marvel Mystery Comics. The purpose of this presentation is to inform you about the history of Marvel, the company's many struggles, and how it became the giant it is today. The story of Marvel Comics is important because it shows how passionate people can create beloved stories that greatly affect the world and last for generations to come. I've been reading comics most of my life and always loved Marvel Comics the most. Much of this interest I have in Marvel can be traced back to the hard work of the early Marvel comic legends. Throughout this presentation, I will discuss the early days of Marvel Comics and its evolution under the legendary Stan Lee, along with discussing the near bankruptcy Marvel experienced in the 90s and Marvel leading into the modern age. Timely Comics' superhero stories would become extremely popular. New superheroes would be created, such as Captain America, and popularity skyrocketed. This success would allow the owner to hire on new staff, such as Stanley Lieber. This success would die down once World War II ended, however. Around that time, Timely Comics transitioned into Atlas Comics by absorbing 59 shell companies. Atlas Comics would soon end their superhero comic lines and focus on other topics. A few years later, Atlas would try to resurrect some of their old superhero comics, but the popularity was gone. By the late 1950s, Atlas's competitor, DC Comics, had successfully resurrected superhero comics in the form of Batman, Superman, and the Justice League. This led to Atlas, which was slowly beginning to transition into calling itself Marvel, to follow suit. By 1961, writer and editor Stan Lee began creating superhero comics that appealed to adult audiences rather than children, thus beginning the Marvel Age of Comics, as Marvel calls it in their journal about Stan Lee's enduring legacy at Marvel Comics. This new era saw the introduction of many heroes such as the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Avengers, and the reintroduction of Captain America. Spider-Man turned into the publisher's most successful book due to the hero having problems that the readers were able to relate to. Marvel also adopted the idea of all events being meaningful because the characters would remember them, just like the readers would remember them. This was looked into by the historical and mythical time in Marvel and DC series. They did a journal all about this. All this was important, but what really set Marvel apart was Stan's soapbox. This was a column where Stan Lee wrote to the reader about what was going on in order to make them feel more involved at Marvel. This was another piece of Stan Lee's enduring legacy at Marvel Comics. Marvel experienced an era of success from the 60s until the 90s. The company began experimenting with new heroes and adding new comics. During this time, some of the most iconic stories were created. However, by the mid-1990s, Marvel fell on hard times. Stan Lee had left regular duties at Marvel years before, and with his departure came the end of Stan's soapbox. Several of Marvel's most prized comic writers and artists left the industry to create Image Comics. The industry was also experiencing a slump, and people were losing interest in Marvel's characters. Marvel was forced to file Chapter 11 bankruptcy. According to Historical and Mythical Time in Marvel Comics and DC Series Journal, Marvel was forced to sell off some of its merchandising and movie production rights to stay afloat. Marvel attempted to use this as an opportunity to reboot some of their underperforming characters, but messed up. They eventually found a way to undo their changes and restore their characters to the status quo before hiring a new editor-in-chief and production team to save the comic heroes. As the new millennia began, Marvel's newest editor-in-chief was Joe Quesada, and he had a vision to revive the Marvel Universe. Quesada worked with the Marvel team to change up the main universe and create a line of comics that took place in an alternate reality called the Ultimate Universe, in an attempt to draw in new readers. Both of Quesada's plans worked, and Marvel's popularity grew once more. The company also launched an online reading subscription service that would help bring Marvel Comics to new modern audiences. At the same time, Sony and Fox were producing movies based on Marvel characters after acquiring the rights back in the 90s. Sony had the right to Spider-Man, Fox had the right to X-Men and the Fantastic Four. Leading up to 2008, Marvel witnessed the success of the X-Men and Spider-Man movies and decided to make an attempt of their own. 2008 would see the release of Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, thereby beginning the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In 2009, Marvel Entertainment was acquired by Walt Disney Company. More Marvel movies would be produced with Disney, and the comics would continue to thrive. Marvel would also be able to strike up a partnership deal with Sony in order to bring Spider-Man into the MCU, leading to a great success for both companies. In 2015, the Marvel Comics universe would experience a soft reboot to bring some of the Ultimate Universe characters, such as Miles Morales' Spider-Man, into the main comics universe. This would prove to be a great successful move. After much discussion, Disney acquired Fox in 2019 and gained the rights to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four back. Both of these teams have yet to be seen in the MCU, but it is expected that they will appear in the future. Marvel Comics began as a small company that turned into something that has become a part of daily life for many people. People like Stan Lee working at Marvel knew how powerful the company was becoming and understood that with great power comes great responsibility. This is why Marvel Comics has always acted as a force of good, and it has succeeded.